Men have a serious problem. They don't have boobs, and at one point in Japanese history, this flaw kept many men down, until they found a genius solution to get around biology. A wet nurse is someone whose job is breastfeeding. Being the wet nurse of the prince was a pretty sweet deal. Not only did you get the love and affection of a cute little bebe, if he grew up to be an emperor, you would be standing right behind him, ready to cash in on that imperial influence. The role of wet nurses became so powerful that men started wanting a slice of it. But no matter how hard they squeezed, they just couldn't summon a single drop of milk from their chest regions. Biology's a bitch, and they no longer wanted to play with her, so they found some clever ways to solve the problem. First, husbands of wet nurses used their wives to climb the career ladder. Second, they made male wet nurses, which not only flipped the Japanese imperial court upside down, it also caused their own downfall. It's kind of funny how differently wet nurse husbands treated their wards, depending on whether the kid was a boy or a girl. The wet nurse herself usually loved her milk child like a mother would, no matter what. But if the kid was a girl, her husband wanted little to do with her. This is common in history. We're not sure why, but most historians have come to the conclusion that girls suffered from an unnamed genetic condition that prevented them from becoming emperors. However, if the child was a boy, then that same husband would become the most attentive, loving, life lesson teaching Mufasa motherfucker you'd ever seen. The ward was his ticket to the promised land of power and nobility, where toast was always covered with avocado. When a ward grew up, he became his wet nurse's patron, giving her family all kinds of privileges. In this wet nurse system, you could rise really high depending on whose child you changed diapers for. Take this guy, Fujiwara no Michinori. Buddhist priest by day and a wet nurse husband by day also. His wife was the milk mother to Emperor Go-Shirakawa. Michinori was a legendary wet nurse husband of the Heian period. He used his status to pretty much run the court from behind the emperor. People said he handled all matters in the realm, great and small, just as he wished. Life as a wet nurse husband was nice and easy to mess up, partly because the imperial court was full of backs and people who loved to stab them, but also because people hated when wet nurse families tried to marry into high-ranking families. Michinori was smart and a great manager of men, the wettest of wet nurse husbands. But even he couldn't last long before he fell. Since the imperial family and those at the top of the court picked wet nurses from among the middle and lower parts, the top nobility often saw wet nurse families as outsiders. These people should feel lucky they get to hang out with us. Pass me the servant. And since wet nurse power was temporary, it went away after the patron died, wet nurse husbands often tried to make their status permanent by marrying into families whose tatami mats were worth more than your future. The rest of the court called such husbands aggressive and arrogant, greedy men looking to get around the rightful social order. Wet nurse husbands who didn't try to marry up had good reputations. You get a sense that people thought these husbands knew their place. When Michinori tried to marry his daughter to Taira no Kiyomori, it was his biggest mistake. He made an enemy of Minamoto no Yoshitomo, a man known for being a great warrior and for being the heartbroken guy who wanted to marry her first. Yoshitomo joined some of Michinori's enemies to start a rebellion that resulted in Michinori's decapitation. He got ahead of himself and paid the price. Now, wet nurse husbands were powerful, but wait till you get a load of male wet nurses. The word for wet nurse is menoto. In the later Heian period, a new word became popular, menoto, pronounced the same, but written differently. It meant father of the wet nurse. But there was one weird thing about this word. You didn't actually have to be her father. So that we don't all get confused, let's call the new word menoto father. Now, marrying your daughter to a powerful family was a great strategy because the heir of that family would be raised under your roof, every day enjoying a steady diet of fine rice and political opinions. At that time, married daughters lived in their father's home. But what if a man couldn't marry his daughters to some fancy pants family? Well, he got the same benefit by convincing some fancy pants family to make his daughter the menoto of their heir. Before long, every mid-level nobleman with a daughter and a dream chased after the menoto father position. In the early 1100s, the menoto father of the emperor took over important government duties, like managing the emperor's clothing, which sounds like a joke, but it seriously wasn't. Just ask any two girls who went to a wedding with the same outfit. Greetings, your highness. Oh. Being an emperor's Menoto father, the emperor might swing by your house for tea, hang out, do important business there, making your house like a second imperial palace. People wanted the position so much that the meaning of the word Menoto kept changing, until, by the end, it became unrecognizable. Now remember the new word Menoto, meaning wet nurse father? Reading experts agree that for a man to be called this, he must satisfy two requirements. He must be a father, and his daughter must be a wet nurse. But over time, requirements for being a Menoto father disappeared like your standards after a few pints. The father requirement quietly slipped away, meaning a Menoto father could be a husband or a brother or any man really, even someone unrelated to the wet nurse. Pretty soon, the wet nurse requirement followed after father. The official wet nurse no longer had to breastfeed the ward. So what was left of this word? Not much. Menoto father became an honorary title that people fought over, its original meaning lost. For a ward, your official wet nurse was as wet as the Sahara Desert, and her Menoto father didn't even have to be related to her. Words no longer meant things. And so, the Menoto system stopped revolving around female wet nurses and shifted orbit to wet nurse fathers. We'll call them male wet nurses. The actual women breastfeeding and taking care of the bebe, who had such elevated status before, found that the highest they could rise now was up to the cupboard to grab the breast pump. This new system was great for Menoto fathers, but it carried a fatal flaw that eventually led to its own destruction. Can you guess what it was? With these titles becoming honorary, each emperor usually had an Avengers team of Menoto fathers who were his most trusted advisors. And by the 1200s and early 1300s, Menoto families had grabbed control of the Japanese court, most of them from the mid-tier nobility. Biological mothers and grandfathers complained that they no longer had the trust and affection of a young emperor. We fed him, we changed his nappies, but now it's all Menoto this, Menoto that. Late in the Kamakura period, the military industrial complex turned the court upside down. The court was mostly controlled by a few Menoto families. These families that the elites of the court usually called, oh yes, them, had milked their way to the top. They had a simple strategy that worked wonders. A strategy to ensure they didn't lose power when their patron emperor died. Step 1, crank out wet nurses and have them assigned to as many imperial princes as possible. Step 2, work to make them emperor, even the lazy ones. Step 3, when one of your princes climbs the chrysanthemum throne full of gratitude and trust, use that influence to marry into powerful houses, making your family a permanent part of the court. And step 4, rinse the milk and repeat. It's brilliant. If your patron emperor died, you'd still have candidates stored away in the back of the fridge to become the next emperor. It was pretty effective. Toshimitsu of the Hino family served as Menoto father for 3 emperors and married daughters to emperors and shoguns to continue his lineage. The Saionji had Menoto ties to almost all Kamakura period emperors. It was the golden age of wet nursing, but eventually, as every bachelor will tell you, milk goes sour. Nothing lasts forever. This new Menoto system had a huge flaw. Remember, the original power of wet nurses came from something dreadfully inconvenient. They had to actually nurse their children and take care of them. In a shock to medieval Japanese nobles, people found that children tended to enjoy love and affection. So they grew up forming strong, trusting bonds with their wet nurses. Emperors couldn't help but listen to the advice of women who wiped their butts. But with the new system where official wet nurses didn't even have to breastfeed, and wet nurse fathers didn't even have to be related, milk children grew up not forming that strong bond of trust with these people, and gradually the title of Menoto became worthless. At the beginning, though, the bond between a wet nurse and her milk child was stronger than any other bond. Check out this video to see how women use this trust to build up their power in the court. We have a new emperor on Patreon today, Gao Rowan. You are the best. We also have some new regular patrons, Arcee, Motsu, Melody Cook, A Blue Fish, More Failings, and Pokere Paiwei. I'm so sorry. You're all amazing. Alright, I love you, and spread the knowledge.